We're going to catch up with Jesus in his final 24 hours through John's gospel. Now, this begins in chapter 18, just after Jesus made a long prayer. Judas had left to conspire with the religious authorities, and now in the garden, Judas will be unhappily reunited with his teacher. John chapter 18, verse 1. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now Judas, who had betrayed him, also knew the place, for Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas, having procured a band of soldiers and some officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, went there with lanterns and torches and weapons. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said, "Whom do you seek?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. So he asked them again, "Whom do you seek?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. So if you seek me, let these men go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "Of whom you gave me, I have lost not one." Then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and he struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink the cup that the Father has given me?" There's so many themes in the Bible coming to fruition here. Because in the beginning of the story, there was a garden. And this garden, God was with man in perfect harmony. Mankind had an intimate relationship with God and each other until man rejected God's word and rebelled against his rule and authority. And so the original design for a relationship of intimacy with God and humankind was destroyed. And so back in that original garden, when God came walking through, Adam and Eve fell back, hiding from his glory. God handed out to them the punishment of death, which would slowly crush their bodies until they breathed their last. And so God removed them from his garden. And we remember in Genesis 3:24, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, God is once again walking through a garden. But this time, man has come with flame and sword. They still fall back when met with the "I am," yet they press on towards their deadly aim. They declare that God must leave the garden and himself face the curse of death. Although this is not the end of the story, we know the end of the story. So the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they led him to Annas, for he was father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. It was Caiaphas who had advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. Now, Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. Since that disciple was known to the high priest, he entered with Jesus into the court of the high priest. But Peter stood outside at the door. So the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to the servant girl who kept watch at the door and brought Peter in. The servant girl at the door said to Peter, "You also are not one of this man's disciples, are you?" He said, "I am not." Now the officers and servants had made a charcoal fire because it was cold, and they were standing and warming themselves. Peter also was standing with them, standing and warming himself. The high priest then questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answered him, "I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple, where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I have said to them. They know what I said." When he said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, "Is that how you answer the high priest?" Jesus answered him, "If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Now Simon Peter was standing and warming himself. So they said to him, "You also are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it and said, "I am not." One of the servants of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Peter again denied it, and at once a rooster crowed. Jesus now is truly alone. Where is the faithful remnant of mankind? Where are the 6,000 that have not bowed their knees to Baal? In the Garden of Gethsemane, there were two groups of men. One faithful to God, and the other rebels bent on murdering their king. And yet, both failed. Of course, that's not the end of the story. Peter managed to get his way to Annas' house before deserting the cause. Most of the disciples didn't even make it that far. Yet, even for bold Peter, he becomes silly putty at the first hint of danger, the rock melting away. If there is to be help for humanity, it will not come from humanity. Even the faithful remnant is found to be false. Peter got the best teaching that a man could get for years, and it was not good enough. If you today are looking for any person for ultimate hope, you're looking in the wrong place, because we need God. We need him every day. So Jesus is being unjustly struck while Peter's warming himself with a pleasant fire. Jesus is being led off to Pilate, and Peter is running with a lie. But this is not the end of the story. We know the end of the story. Verse 28. Then they led him from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves did not enter into the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled and could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside and said to them, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him with your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So ironic here that the Jews, in all of their nationalistic fervor, can't even enforce a law, so weak they've become. Verse 32. This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken, to show them what kind of death he was going to die. So Pilate entered his headquarters and called again Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from this world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you're a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Now Pilate here asks a good question. What is truth? John 1:17, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." John 14:6, "And Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." The fact is that even as Pilate asks what is truth, truth is standing right before him, but he can't see it. After he said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, "I find no guilt in him, but you have a custom that I should release one man to you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews?" They cried out again, "Not this man, but Barabbas." Now Barabbas was a robber. The fact is that unregenerate men do not want to deal with the truth. And so they choose to believe a soothing lie. Jesus for Barabbas, the giver of life for a murderer, the king for a rebellious insurrectionist, the truth for a lie. They chose a wicked man like themselves instead of God himself. But thankfully, this is not the end of the story. We know the end of the story. Chapter 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. Jesus was stripped naked, tied to a post, whipped with a leather flail-like device designed to disfigure and shred skin. This is more painful than anything you or I have ever experienced. And this is just the start of Jesus' journey. Verse 2. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again and said to them, "See, I'm bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him." So Jesus came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Behold the man!" Now this, like everything with Jesus' death, is at the same time brutal and amazing. Jesus is standing with a robe and a crown in Jerusalem before the leading people. He is the king. And yet at the same time, This is all mockery by the Romans to shame the Jewish people into never aspiring towards a king. This is meant to mock Jesus, the author of life, to expose him as a false king, and yet this is him as the real king, the suffering servant. He is what the Jewish nation needs, even the king that the mocking soldiers need, because all of them need this king suffering and dying in their place. This is wretched that in Jesus, who in truth and justice is condemned in a corrupt judge's lie. And yet this is beautiful because God gives his life for these same sinful men that mock him. Verse 6. When the chief priest and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." Whoa. Time out. Somebody slipped here because they brought Jesus to Pilate as a dangerous insurrectionist. But now the truth is revealed. It always does in time. Pilate knows the truth, which he suspected all along, that this is a religious matter, and the Jewish leaders are trying to get him to do their dirty work. And yet, as we hurtle to the conclusion of this grand cosmic miscarriage of justice, never let us forget that this was God's plan all along. And the series of seemingly random events are held firmly by the hand of God as he watches his son be lied about and scorned because he meant to die for all mankind. Verse 8. When Pilate heard the statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me. Do you know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all, unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." It's incredible in the face of the most powerful man, from a worldly perspective, that Jesus has ever spoken to. Jesus is mostly indifferent. Jesus is impressed by the faith of children, but totally nonplussed by the bluster of powerful rulers. Verse 12, from then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, which is in Aramaic Gabbatha. Now, it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, noon, high noon. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." And they cried out, "Away, away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And really, in their rejection, Caesar is their only king. Caesar is a hard taskmaster. Verse 16. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. At that time, when the Passover lambs are being slaughtered. The king, the true sacrifice that takes away the sin of the world, is marched away to his death, while his people declare that they have no king but Caesar. And yet this is not the end of the story. We know the end of the story. So they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him with two others, one on either side, and Jesus between them. Something that is often misunderstood is that crucifixion is not really an execution device. It's a torture device that happens to kill you eventually. It's designed to inflict as much pain as the human body can bear. Jesus' wrists were nailed to the cross. He was raised up with his hands on the crossbar, raised up, his head seared with thorns, his back pressed against the wood, splitting open from the flogging, his arms screaming with pain from the nails, his chest burning as he had to pull himself up to take every breath. And all of this as he was naked beside a public road. Crucifixions were warnings. They wanted these things public. The crowd was the point. And so they gathered, the scoffers mocking the Lord of life. Verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said, to fulfill Scripture, I thirst. And a jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth, just like a sacrifice being offered. And when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. In the beginning, we rebelled from God, taking forbidden fruit from a tree. And from that tree we became cursed to death. But now in the cross, God has ascended the cursed tree to become a curse in our place and declared, "It is finished." And it was. But this is not the end of the story. We know the end of the story.